microphone, you were not singing, and I was like, I'll take the microphone back.
It's just emotions taking me over. Well,
what an appropriate song.
Yeah, William Jamar Wright.
And I'm Hattie.
And this is our podcast, HattieJo. Of course, we're entering 2020. Hope it is going well for you all. Actually, I had a thought that we would switch it up a little bit and kind of talk about the whole year, just different types of emotions.
The whole upcoming year.
Yeah, the whole upcoming year. So 2020, each month we will talk about a different emotion and kind of just how that emotion, like memories, like how that emotion makes you feel, or I guess not how it makes you feel, but just I think you all get what I'm.
Times we felt that emotion.
Yes, times we felt that emotion. Stereotypes, debunking things about that emotion, and so this whole year we'll be talking about different emotions. But this first episode, I thought
we also might pop in a few minutes of anything new that's happening with us. I'm just leaving the door open for that. But in general, I think we're always going to be talking about.
Yeah. I mean,
we'll tie it back to the emotions. And so on.
Yeah. So that's what we're doing. In this first episode, I think we should just have a conversation about just emotions in general.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask, what emotion are we doing today?
Yeah, emotions in general. Okay. And just the difference between guy emotions and how we kind of experience emotions. And how females may
stereotypical much.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think, first of all, we should talk about stereotypes, but it's also pushing past those stereotypes and kind of debunking them a little bit.
Okay, I can get on board with debunking the stereotypes.
Because I definitely feel there are definitely stereotypes about guys and the way we handle emotions. And I definitely there are stereotypes for a reason, and some stereotypes are held on too tightly and are too rigid. But there are definitely stereotypes for a reason. Specific to emotions.
Yeah, and whether that reason is because that's just naturally how men and women are different, or if that's because society encourages one and discourages another in the two different sexes, or a combination of both.
Yeah. I think it's always a combination.
I think it's always a combination of both too. But I do want to point out that anytime it's the stereotypes are there for a reason, it's not always just because that's just how people are, right? No, I do think that some of it is our society.
Yeah, and I think also some of it is that's how some people are, but some of it is they've been raised to be that way, and there are some environmental
right. And so
factors.
whether it's society or their parents or
yes,
right, they've learned, this is a behavior I should exhibit versus this is a behavior I shouldn't exhibit, or this emotion is okay for me to display versus this emotion is not okay for me to display.
Yeah. That
can often be learned responses as opposed to just natural humanity.
True. Yes.
Okay, now that we got that out of the way.
So I would say from a male perspective about emotions, I definitely think that it's thrown out there that men should not be emotional, or your emotions should be limited to very certain situations.
So when you say your emotions are men should not be emotional, to me, let's define what that means, because I think that often when people say men, or when people say don't be so emotional, or what I interpreted from your comment, men shouldn't be emotional, what I really heard you saying was men shouldn't exhibit certain behaviors or display certain emotions.
Yes.
And I think that's very different than just not being emotional in general. I think not being emotional in general is like you're flatline, you're neither high nor low.
Psychopath, yeah.
Yeah, you're like a sociopath. It's just like, right? And so I think that we should make some clarifications on that, because I would say that in the traditional way that you were meaning the word of like, oh, men shouldn't be emotional, I would agree that you are not that emotional in that use of the word. But in what I believe is like the true definition of emotional, I think you're a very emotional person, right? Like you experience a lot of emotions.
Yes, I do experience.
Right? And so like I would never want to say, oh, well, he's not that emotional, and have anyone interpret like, man, like,
what's wrong with him?
Yeah. And I think that goes again to our society, right? Oh, men shouldn't be emotional, and we associate emotional with like hysterics or like, you know, big
and I would
displays
definitely not say,
and like no, you know.
I would definitely like say that I'm not like, I very rarely have I ever, or will I ever see myself in the future getting like hysterical. I don't like.
I agree with that.
I don't think like hysterical is an emotional range that like
you exhibit often. I agree. Forever. Yeah. I agree. But I think that's, again, I think that the use of the term, oh, men shouldn't be emotional, usually more implies things
certain
more
very
to
specific.
Yes, something very specific.
Yeah, something very specific. And it's funny, like, when I think of, like, my competitive nature, or, like...
It's hilarious that you said that, because I was going to say, for instance, I find that men are often extremely emotional, especially when it comes to competition, and, like...
Yeah.
So, like, I was just going to use that as an example, especially in sports, that's a way that men are often extremely emotional. Yes. It's funny that you brought that same thing up.
And I was thinking specifically for me, just like when I play like basketball or something, and oftentimes it has been, you have made the comment that like I wear my emotions on my face, or like I can't.
That's not just playing basketball, that's all the time, but like basketball too.
So I definitely like have noticed myself, like, first of all, there's sometimes like, and it varies, like some days like I just wear it on my face. I'm just like, I'm frustrated. Like, I don't get, like, some people do some dumb things, and I'm just like, that emotion of
Peeps
like
be cray. That's my
frustration. Like, it is just all over my face. But sometimes I like say it out loud, like, what are you doing? And like, I am vocal.
A lot of times.
I would not say, I don't think it's a lot of times.
Well, maybe for you, the number of times you say it in your head or are feeling it, and the number of times you say it out loud are low. But I find anytime I've played any sort of sport with you, you're wear your emotions on your face, but you're also very vocal with them. Like every time that we play, not in a bad way always.
Yeah.
Right, but every time we've played the co-ed flag football, I wasn't thinking of that one, but I was thinking of basketball.
Intramurals.
Intramurals, yeah, and just the like, what are you doing? Or like, oh, over here, or like, good shot, you know, you got that. Like, you're very, it swings both ways with the positive and the negative emotions, but I felt very much that in some of those times you were like trying to rein it in, but it was still, or when I've watched you or been around in the gym running or whatever, and then I was done early and you're still playing basketball, and it wasn't a co-ed thing, right? I just think you're vocal, that's all.
Oh, yeah, well, it's funny because I don't think that sometimes it's like an emotional, it's just communication. So like with basketball specifically, like it's important to like communicate and kind of give like, or at least I think it's positive, like give positive feedback and to like let people know that they're doing something right. Yeah. So like I do think with basketball, like I try and communicate a lot, so that people like know what's going on.
All I was trying to say is I've heard many times you say, "What are you doing?" Like on the basketball court.
So the emotion of frustration. Yeah. And it definitely does.
Which is fair.
I have had to rein that in, or I've tried to rein that in.
But I think that's also really common. Like, you see coaches all the time. I mean, in elite gymnastics, I athlete falls off. And I would say that displaying this behavior is more frequent, I think, in the male coaches, but I don't want to say that it's only in the male coaches, because I'm sure it's not, especially if we think about NCAA gymnastics. But I feel like the NCAA coaches are generally more reserved. But you see an athlete fall or something, they're like, oh, you know, or like noticeably upset.
NCAA coaches do that?
No, I would say NCAA coaches are much better about not doing that. And only really showing emotion when it's a positive reinforcement. But I've seen plenty, and they like make GIFs on the gym internet all the time of like coaches showing their frustration at an athlete's performance. And I can only imagine that that's true in all sports, right? The number of times you hear F-bombs dropped just watching college basketball when, you know, a certain call is made by the head coaches, or football, you know.
Well, it's funny, like...
So I guess what I'm not trying to say that it's uncommon for someone to express their frustration.
Yeah, and I think specifically for sports, the word accountability comes up a lot. And
team sports, I imagine, because that's never once come up for me.
Like, you wouldn't say, like, in gymnastics, like, accountability is something that you, like, is talked about?
No. I mean, I'm sure it is in team sports. And maybe in college gymnastics, we should ask Jen. Because I think there is a lot of accountability for the team scores counting. And so you need to hold your teammates accountable for doing, and each teammate themselves needs to be accountable to themselves for doing good practice, so that when it comes to the meet, we can count on you. But in an individual context, that was never once, I mean, maybe once or twice, like, you guys need to be accountable to yourselves, like, don't cheat on your conditioning, you're only cheating yourself. Like, that idea might have been discussed a few times, but very rarely was the word accountability used. I could come up with like 5 or 10 words that would be used before that.
Gotcha. Well, I guess, yeah, because I'm around, like, I've only done team sports. I've never done an individual sport. And I really can't, like, outside of swimming, tennis.
Running, like track and field. I mean, badminton, if you're going with the tennis thing, wrestling, fencing, like most of the Olympic sports.
Yeah.
I would say.
But I was like, yeah, and even at like Duke, like all of those sports, like you're counting on your teammate for like the team score or something. It's never...
Right, and that's why I did put the qualifier. Like, I didn't compete in college gymnastics. And so when I was competing in the sport, it was purely individual. Like, yeah, they have like some awards where it's like the team that won, but you'd have teams with 50 girls. Well, that's an exaggeration. Teams with like 15 girls and teams with 3. So they're just taking like the top 3 scores on each team. Like, very few people, in my recollection growing up doing club gymnastics, really cared or remembered what the team result was. They were just worried like, oh, did I win the all around? Did, you know, on the individual. Anyway, we're digressing, sorry.
Yeah, I would say that, like...
So accountability.
Yeah, just accountability. And specifically to, like, the frustration and the like, expressing that frustration. That is one thing that, like, through sports, it has always been told, like, you need to hold your teammates accountable. And by holding them accountable, we are giving you permission to speak about like how you feel and express your emotion however you see fit.
Interesting. So you're tying accountability specifically to the expressing of emotion.
Yes.
And that's one way you hold your teammates accountable?
Yes. And I would say that's like true in just throughout my like sports career. And whether you do that in like a public setting where like a bunch of people are around, or you do it in like a private one-on-one setting, like holding your teammates accountable, and you hold your teammates accountable by like expressing like how you feel, like what they're doing, maybe what they're doing and how that comes back to the team and its performance.
And so would you say that that's mostly outside of game time or during game time as well?
It's anytime like somebody's not doing well, or if they are doing well, like giving them positive feedback as well.
Because I definitely can see, of course, I always just think back to the gymnastics context, like holding, if I were to define what it means to hold someone accountable, it's more making sure, and it includes yourself, that every day you're doing the things you should be doing. Whether that's going to class on time, going to talk to the TA if you need it, making sure you do all your reps and your conditioning, making sure that you're not like out partying way late, like those types of things. But I would never, until you brought up the whole accountability and expressing your frustration, I would never have thought that, like, say your teammate falls, that part of the accountability is then telling her, like, I'm pissed off that you fell. Do you know what I mean? Or like expressing any frustration like that.
Well, your frustration would be like, if you fail, and you fail because like you went out and like you didn't, like you like let down the team standards or whatever, like you broke a team rule, and because you're really good, coach is still gonna play you, but like we should hold you accountable for like our team standards, and like whatever we as a team decide, like we need to we need to hold each other accountable. That's separate from like just a mistake was made. Like if the teammate like was doing all the things they should be doing, and they had a performance that was not acceptable. Yes. Okay. All right. Yeah. That makes more sense. That is definitely separate from just like if a mistake is made. Gotcha. Because I would feel in what you just said, even if no mistake was made game time, if it was like in practice, like dropping a lot of passes because you're tired because you're out drinking all night, or like we have the same class together, you're not showing up and you're asking me for my notes, like even if we can still play the game and no technical mistakes, like huge errors were made by that individual in the game, I would still feel the frustration of wanting to like discuss that with the teammate. I think it definitely, like, that's definitely more individual. Right, and I guess that's my point, is I get the sense from you that a lot of it comes back to the performance in the competition. A large part of it does, yes. Which is not necessarily right, because you would hope that, like, that accountability, you hold them to that, no matter the situation. But like, I just was trying to clarify. Yeah, so I think just kind of going off like emotions. I would say like stereotypically, anger is an emotion that is okay for men to like display, express. I would say that crying is one that they're not. Crying is not something that is okay to, or except for very select situations, crying is not an expression of sadness that's encouraged. Yes. Or frustration. I cry a lot because I'm frustrated. Mm-hmm. So crying is not a behavior that's encouraged unless it's expressing a certain emotion. Yes. Crying is more of a behavior, not an emotion. Yeah. But crying because of sadness. And that is very much like split up. Like if you're crying because you're sad that you lost the game, then it's okay. Like we love to see our athletes cry. Right, or crying because your teammate got injured. Right? Like if it was like your best buddy and it's like post game, you're like, oh, it was like terrible. I don't think that would be like, honestly, I don't think that one would be. People, really? I think people would like, oh, like he cares. Like I don't think that would like. But like, especially or specifically for football, so you can't care about other people. Don't no, you can care about other people, but like, you're not. If somebody's out there crying, then they might. I'm not saying like sobbing. I'm saying like a tear slips down or two. Like, why? Like you couldn't hold that back. Like, it's someone's health. It's just a game. Like you couldn't hold that back. You lost the game. Like that has nothing to do with anything. But, I would definitely say it's not. Homie gets injured. Stereotypically, it's not okay to like cry because your boy got hurt during a game. And I think that's. Just I mean, like, okay, so I guess I understand if it's like, oh, he rolled his ankle or like pulled his hamstring. But But even when I brought this ACL, up, I'm thinking about when they're like, the whole game stops, like they're carted off. It's like, you know, the whole team comes out. You see
you know, to like wish the guy well as he goes back. Like if the camera's like closing in and like a dude has like a tear, I don't think anyone's gonna be thinking any less of him.
No, but I just don't think the guy would cry.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So crying definitely has to be like on the extreme sadness.
And not a frustration.
Yeah, definitely not a frustration.
Well,
and I do think that that is
like
changing
losing a game
bit.
could be somewhat out of frustration.
But like,
it's mostly
you don't,
sadness.
yeah, you don't cry like, or you don't feel so sad because you lost like a regular season game. You feel
talking
sad.
About championship when you lose.
No, you feel sad because like your season is over and this is the last game you're gonna play with your boys. Like the last game of the season, because
So it's okay to care about the boys when it's the last game of the season.
But like you're not crying. Yes, it is. Like them's the rules. I don't make the rules.
But you know, it's not the last game because like homie tore his ACL. Like can't cry about that then.
But like if you tear your ACL and you get hurt, chances are you're gonna be able to come back and play again.
Not if it's the end of your senior year or the beginning of your senior year.
No, well if it happens, it depends on when it happens. But basically the emotion of being able to like, I do think that like the expressing of emotions, it is becoming more acceptable to like for males to express their emotions.
I agree.
And not just the like angry or like frustration, like not just those type of emotions, but also like some of the joy, which it's like I don't know if I'm trying to like I don't know the positive emotions. I don't know if I see those being expressed, like joy and things like that. I don't know if I see those being expressed, but I do think some of like the negative emotions that oftentimes like males have a tendency to like bundle up and keep inside. I do think it is becoming more socially acceptable for those emotions to be expressed.
So which emotions specifically?
Well, just like the negative ones that we've been talking about that are like.
Well, because I feel like it's always been common for guys to express frustration and anger. Like that's never been like not socially acceptable. So when you're saying it's becoming more common for it to be acceptable to express some of these negative emotions, I'm asking which ones you're talking about.
Well, I think just like sadness.
Okay. I would agree with that.
Yeah, and I guess like
I would never say that homosexuality is an emotion, but I think it kind of goes along with what you're talking about. Something that normally people might be conditioned to hold inside. People are more feeling the freedom to discuss their sexual preference.
Yes.
And I feel like that's usually a lot more.
And I think, honestly, that some of our, like, the male gender specifically's ability to be able to, like, express emotion is linked directly to, like, our society's acceptance. Our society's becoming more accepting of, like, homosexuality and, like, the diversity of, like...
That is emotional. The emotional spectrum. I agree. And when you said you didn't see as many examples of the positive feelings being expressed, I would agree with you, but I feel that there are a lot more of expressions of males showing some of these positive feelings. Like I think it's a lot more common now to like have guys hug each other, or as opposed to just a handshake or like a bro slap. You know what I mean?
It's funny. I've always felt that like it wasn't like a long and embracing hug, but like I've always felt like guys have like.
Well, I feel like your friend group does a good job with that, and that might be because of you. But I think there are many males where they hug their mother and they hug their wife, and maybe their kids and nobody else, right? Or like.
Really?
Yes, and I feel that there are a lot of other expressions of like pride and like pride in your child's accomplishments, or instead of, I'm thinking like, what's that guy Foreman's, the father on that 70s show?
Eric Foreman?
Eric's
or
dad.
Eric's dad.
Anyway, the character, like, I feel like you would never see that character hug one of his children, right? And or even say anything positive, like, I'm proud of you, son, right? And so, granted, that's the show's set in the 70s, so the guy grew up in the 50s, right? Like, that's a long time ago, but I think some of that still persists, but I think a lot of that has changed, where I think it's very common for males to show that they're proud, to say that they're proud, to give a lot of cuddles to their young kids, to stick up for their children, to, when they have only daughters, they're not upset, right? And be just as proud about their daughters' accomplishments and just as involved and with their daughters' lives than they are just with their sons' lives. And, we've seen a lot of, not a lot, but some athletes that have children going through some things that make statements about it. Whereas I feel like in the past, and they're making statements of like, my child deserves to be loved just like every other human being.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel that would, like 20 or 30 years ago, you would never see any of that.
Yeah, and I think...
So to me, that's one of those expressions of males with some of the more positive...
Yes.
Like outpourings of love.
And I think it like coincides a little bit with like social media. But I would say this is like a phenomenon that's really only been around for like the past like 4 or 5 years. Like the like proud sentiment, or at least like with like my... Because I think it's been shifting over generations, and with like social media making us all a little bit more connected, we're able to see these males that were like, oh, like, you know what, this is something that like I wish that like I would have had like when I was growing up, or I wish that my father would have said, like, he was there for me, I knew that he loved me, but like these public displays, like I wish that was something that I had. And so, yeah. So how would you say, like, stereotypically, like, females?
I would say the number one thing that females are stereotypically is a caregiver. And so, again, that's not an emotion, but the emotion of empathy and caring about how another human being is doing, I think is very, in our society, stereotypically attributed to women. Right? Like, your child's in the hospital, which parent do you expect is there? The mom, right? For days on end, so like she has to not go to work, she has to sleep in the hospital all night. Like, child is sick, who do you expect is doing anything about that? It's on vacation, so let's take the work thing out of it. It's like, oh, the mom's going to take care of this, or just any little thing. And so I think that is kind of a gender role in our society, but I think it stems from, how you're talking about some stereotypes are kind of true. It stems from, I think, the societal belief or stereotype that women have more of that empathy. Whereas, like, there are plenty of men that are just as capable and just as caring, right? They notice when their child is sick. They notice when their child is upset. They want to comfort their child, right? But I don't think that the act of comforting a child that's either in pain or upset is traditionally viewed as male. Like, I think if I were to say, imagine an adult comforting a child, do you imagine a man doing it or a woman?
I would definitely say, like, it's a woman, or in that situation, it'd be a woman.
Right. But I think and again, I think that's not an image we see a lot in media, but it's totally changing.
Yes.
Right? So I think now we're starting to see a lot more of the man being just as much a caretaker of the family, more than just financially, but an actual caretaker of the family just as much as the woman is.
Yeah. And providing some emotional support.
Emotional support, right. Whereas I feel like in the past that was not the case. at all traditional. Even though, like I would say that my father and his father, I don't know what it was like for him growing up, but like my grandpa has always been very like providing emotional support. Right? Like all my dad's brothers and my dad himself are that way. So clearly they had to learn that from someone. And it's not that my Grammy's not, like she was as well, but you know what I mean? I feel like there's always exceptions, and maybe what society says isn't always like accurate on a microcosm basis.
Mm-hmm.
Or like maybe once you step out the door, then you have to put on this role, but once you're inside, you're just as emotionally supportive. I don't know. All I'm trying to say is that I think men have it in them, and I think it's great that our culture is starting to be more accepting of that and encouraging of that.
Like I'm just making this observation here, but it's funny. Like I asked you specifically, like what are the emotions that like stereotypically about women?
Yeah, and it's being empathetic.
But I feel like the discussion we kind of just had was like about like males and like how they like stereotypically out in like the household, and like they're not like empathetic, but like I feel like
so I was just contrasting it. I mean, I don't think that anyone would argue that women are not empathetic. I think that's very commonly held observation and belief. I don't know. But my point is that men are just as empathetic, but they don't get the stereotype of being empathetic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. I guess what I would say is I was trying to choose a positive one. I think men, right? It's pretty, I view it as positive to be empathetic.
Yeah.
And I think society values that. And
to a degree.
To a degree. And I think it's something like society thinks is a good trait for women to possess. Whereas almost everything else that I feel like is stereotypically female, society looks at it as a bad thing. So I was trying to choose something positive.
Mm.
Right? Like we talked about hysterical. I think it's very easy societally to be like, oh, women are, they're always like, their emotions are everywhere, and like, they're just hysterical. And so I think what that leads to is then when women have feelings, society doesn't take them seriously for those feelings.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, you're frustrated, but in 20 minutes she'll be like totally happy again. Clearly this frustration is not something that's real, right? Or she's upset, like, oh, or like she's mad, like, just the societal view that women's emotions are constantly fluctuating and can go quickly from extreme in one direction to extreme in another direction, therefore undermines those feelings, is really annoying to me. And so I think that is not a positive thing. But I think that that's part of the result of the stereotype that our society has about women and their feelings.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny, like, of course we've had, like, my nephews here, and, like, specifically about, like, their emotions, I try to, like, be progressive, in thinking about, like, the ways that they express themselves,
which is good.
And allowing them to, like, giving them permission to express their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
But also keeping in mind that, like, we do live in, like, a society where, like, you have to have the ability to, like, control your emotions. So, like, for instance, right. There'll be a time where, like, my nephew, he'll be crying, and, like, he's crying because of, like, something that, like, he did, and, like, I'm angry at him.
Right. So normally the tears start when he realizes he's getting a punishment. I think some of the times he was crying out of shame and regret. But I think most of the times he was crying out of, I'm losing a privilege and I'm sad about that.
Yeah, and like, so my thought process in those situations where my nephew may be crying was like, is like, first of all, I would say it's okay to cry, but in this situation, you don't have anything to cry about. And I want to have them understand that it's okay to like express their emotions, but like it needs to be an appropriate time and place. And at this time and place, I may not necessarily think that it's appropriate, which is getting me thinking like, who am I to decide when it's like?
Took the words right out of my mouth.
Who am I to decide? Who am I to decide when it's appropriate or not appropriate?
Or also, who are you to decide like what is something worth crying over, right? Because different things feel differently to different people. Mm-hmm. I've already said, I cry out of frustration. I also cry out of sadness, but I will cry about a lot of things that you wouldn't cry about. True. But if someone said to me, especially the adult me, crying about some of the things that I cry about, like, that's not something worth crying over, that just comes off as, like, extremely condescending and patronizing, because I can logically see why, this scenario is not as bad as some other scenario, right? But you don't have to have the worst situation. You don't need to win the worst in order to be upset about something. Yeah. And often expressing your emotions helps you process them and work through them. And so yeah, I definitely understand where you're coming from. Like, I remember my mom telling me, like, nobody will like you if you cry. Like, you need to not cry because you'll have no friends. And I understand her point. Like, at some point, nobody wants to be around, especially a child, like, children friends. If you're crying all the time, right? Like, that's totally true. Not fun. But at the same time, it's like, each person needs their outlet. And if that happens to be your outlet for expressing some of this frustration, yes, you need to learn to deal with that in a positive way. You need to learn to deal with that in a constructive way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should never cry. Yeah.
Well, it's funny too, like, as I've kind of like grown and matured, like, I feel like I don't want to like be judgmental of somebody that's like expressing their emotions, specifically like with crying, because I would say that like growing up, like there was never a lot of like crying was not something that a lot of people, or you just didn't see a lot of people just crying.
Right, like it was often like, if you're gonna cry, go to your room.
Well, no, if you're gonna cry, there needs to be like
something to cry about.
Yeah, something to cry about. And so I've had to grow and like become accepting that, like, you know what, like I may not think that this is something that like that a person would cry about, but like I am not that person, and they may deal with that emotion how they see fit.
Or you may not fully understand the situation, right? Like, there could be times, maybe less so in the context of like your nephew or anything, but there could be times where you just don't understand, right? So like you're judging the situation from your perspective. Is that worth crying over or not? Like, you may have an incorrect perspective of the situation, right? Or one that certainly doesn't match that person's. If you saw it through that person's eyes, it might become something where you're like, okay, I can see why they're crying. Just throwing that out there. Yeah. But like, to my mom's credit, she always used to also say, we have to talk about it if we want to fix it, right? Talking about your problems is the way to find a solution. Like, there's no problem too big that we can't talk through. And so a lot of, with me, when she would be like, if this is that important that you're going to be crying about this, you need to at least be able to calm yourself down so that we can talk about it. And that's something that's still hard for me, but is an important skill, right? Like if that is a behavior that you need as an outlet for some of your emotions, you can't just be crying so hysterically that you can't communicate with someone, right? So learning to, like, I think that's an important skill to have learned if that is going to be a behavior engaging in a lot. Anyway.
Yeah, and I would say, like, along with that, just time. I think if somebody is crying, they need, more than anything, they just need time to be able to process and get to the point where they can communicate. So
yeah. So yeah, we kind of got.
Yeah, it's a little all over the place. But,
yeah, this is the first one.
Yeah,
we got 11 more of these to come. So
I think the most important thing is that, like, you want to have the ability to express your emotions, to tell people, like, how you feel, how you're feeling. It's important to, like, have an outlet, because when those emotions get, like, or I would say when those emotions get, like, bottled in and, like, you don't express them or have an outlet for them, it can become like it can become like a bad situation.
Right.
And the more people express their emotions in a positive, like, in a constructive way,
in a respectful way.
Yeah, I think the better we'll be as a society.
Right, because I don't think any of us are advocating for, like, oh, you feel so frustrated that you want to, like, physically assault someone. I don't think anyone is encouraging that, right? But being able to encourage expressing your frustration in a way that's constructive to the situation and respectful of other people and their bodily autonomy, I think that's very positive. But usually I would say that scenario, I mean, I can't speak for all scenarios, but it usually comes from what you're just talking about, too much stuff bottled inside. So yeah.
All right.
And that's what we're doing this month.
Deuces.
I knew you were going to say deuces.